Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Creaking Floorboards reveal hidden paths. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. Arrival at Hollow House. The fog hung thick in the air as Mira pulled up the long gravel driveway of Hollow House, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The Victorian mansion loomed ahead, its dark, weathered frame towering against the dull sky. Moss crept up its stone foundation, and the wooden shutters groaned in the light breeze. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she pictured her escape a fresh start, but maybe that was the point. Maybe something as broken as this house could help her heal. She turned off the car and stared at the house for a moment, wondering if this was a mistake. A gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. "It's just an old house," she whispered to herself, reaching for the door handle. She was here to forget, to rebuild after the catastrophe that had been her life. She couldn't afford to turn back now. The inside of Hollow House wasn't much better than the outside. Dust-coated furniture, heavy drapes that blocked out most of the light, and a musty smell that clung to the air like it had been trapped for years. But it was hers for now. She would fix it up, make it livable, and maybe in the quiet, she'd find the peace she craved. She had to. Her first night in the house was far from peaceful. Mira lay awake in the large, unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady her breathing. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty halls, the house shifting and settling as old houses do. She told herself it was normal, just the wood contracting in the cool night air. But the sounds grew more distinct, rhythmic, almost like footsteps, pacing just beyond her bedroom door. She sat up, her pulse quickening, ears straining. It stopped. Silence fell over the house, thick and suffocating. Mira swallowed hard, reminding herself that isolation often played tricks on the mind. But the unease settled deep in her gut. There was something off about the house, something she couldn't quite name. The next morning, Mira explored the attic, hoping to distract herself from the nagging feeling that had kept her up all night. Dust swirled in the shafts of light that pierced through the cracked windows. Among the clutter of old trunks and forgotten furniture, she found a set of blueprints tucked away in a corner. They were brittle with age, but the details were clear, peculiar rooms and hidden tunnels, all beneath the surface of the house. Rooms that shouldn't be there. Paths that weren't part of the current layout. A chill crept up her spine again. She glanced around the attic, the shadows seeming darker now, the air heavier. There was more to Hollow House than its creaking floorboards and hollowed walls, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting. Chapter 2. Unseen Watchers. Mira stood frozen in the attic, the blueprints still clutched in her hands. The room seemed to close in around her, shadows creeping from the corners. She felt the house watching her. The faint sounds of footsteps from the night before echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. Her heart raced as she hurried down the narrow stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive stillness. Days passed, but the unease didn't leave. At night, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the sounds growing more distinct, deliberate. She lay awake in bed, staring at the door, waiting for the next noise. The whispers came next, faint but undeniable, like someone breathing in the walls. They brushed against her ears, just out of reach, as though they were waiting for her to listen closer. And then, things began to move. Her keys vanished from the kitchen counter, only to reappear hours later on the floor near the front door. Her bedroom lamp, which she was certain she had turned off, flickered on by itself in the middle of the night. Mira's pulse quickened with every unexplained event. The isolation of Hollow House, which she had hoped would bring her peace, now suffocated her. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, her mind unraveling thread by thread. Was the house playing tricks on her? Or was her trauma from before clawing its way back, blurring the line between past and present? One afternoon, Mira ventured outside, desperate for some fresh air. She met Eli, a grizzled handyman, fixing the loose boards on the porch. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, lingered on her a moment too long, as though he already knew her. He worked in silence, but when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "This house has got a way of getting under your skin," he muttered, barely looking up from his work. There was something unsettling in his tone, a familiarity with the house that Mira didn't like. That same evening, Sarah, the neighbor from down the road, stopped by unannounced. She was a sprightly woman with wide, wary eyes. "You've settled in well, I see," Sarah said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hollow House. It's got a history. Folks around here don't like talking about it much." When Mira pressed for details, Sarah only shook her head, her expression darkening. "Just be careful. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried." That night, the whispers grew louder, creeping under the floorboards, slithering up the walls. Mira tried to ignore them, telling herself it was just the house settling. But as she walked down the hallway, she froze. Through the narrow gaps in the wooden planks, she caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, fleeting but real. It moved beneath her feet, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Mira's breath caught in her throat. There was someone beneath the house. The floorboards were not just creaking. They were hiding something. Something alive. Chapter 3. The Hidden Passage. Mira stood in the hallway, her breath catching in her throat, staring at the spot where she'd seen the shadow slip beneath the floor. The creaking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It hung heavy in the air, as though the house was waiting, holding its breath alongside her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was lurking just out of sight, watching her every move. The next morning, the need for answers gnawed at her. Mira moved through Hollow House, eyes sharp, scanning the floor. Certain boards seemed more worn, the wood smoothed by use, as though they had been walked over for years. She crouched down, pressing her hands to the cool wood, and tapped lightly. Hollow. The sound echoed faintly beneath her fingertips, sending a chill up her spine. Her curiosity overpowered her fear. Armed with a crowbar she found in the garage, Mira pried the old boards loose, wincing as the nails screeched in protest. The first board came up easily, then the second. Beneath them, a dark opening revealed a staircase, narrow and steep, leading into the unknown. She hesitated, her heart racing. Everything in her screamed to stop, to leave it alone. But something deeper, something primal pushed her forward. The air in the passage was thick and stale as she descended, each step creaking beneath her weight. The walls were close, cold stone brushing her shoulders, and the further she went, the darker it grew. The faint scent of mildew hung in the air, mixing with something older, more unsettling. She ran her fingers along the walls as she moved, feeling strange carvings and symbols etched into the stone, their meaning unclear but undeniably ancient. The tunnels stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that disoriented her. Along the edges, she found remnants of a life long forgotten dust-covered furniture, a rusted tricycle, an old doll missing an eye. They were eerily out of place, each object feeling like a silent witness to something terrible, something hidden beneath the surface of time. A faint sound, like a breath, echoed from deeper in the tunnel. Mira froze, her blood turning to ice. She wasn't alone. Her pulse quickened, as her eyes darted to the far end of the passage, where a flicker of movement caught her attention. A shadow, just out of reach, stood motionless. For a moment, Mira's mind refused to believe what she was seeing. But when the shadow shifted, its shape humanoid but wrong, she turned and bolted up the stairs, the narrow walls closing in on her, suffocating her with fear. The floorboards above groaned and creaked as she fled, their rhythmic thudding growing louder with each step she took, as though something was chasing her. She slammed the trapdoor shut behind her, chest heaving, but the creaking didn't stop. It followed her through the house, growing louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was alive, its past rising to meet her in the present. Something was awake beneath Hollow House, and it was coming for her. Chapter 4. Unraveling the Past. Mira slammed the trapdoor shut behind her, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The oppressive silence of Hollow House seemed to swallow her fear, making her head spin with disorienting dread. The creaking of the floorboards had quieted, but the memory of the shadow remained burned in her mind. She needed answers, something to make sense of the terror that had gripped her so tightly. She spent the following days buried in research, her days blending together in a haze of old newspapers, historical records, and dusty library archives. She learned that Hollow House had once belonged to the Ashford family. They had vanished mysteriously, their disappearance leaving no trace. The town's whispers spoke of occult practices and dark rituals conducted in secret tunnels beneath the house. The more Mira uncovered, the more she felt the weight of those secrets pressing down on her. Her nights were plagued by vivid, violent dreams. The house's oppressive presence seeped into her subconscious, twisting her thoughts. She dreamt of shadowy figures moving through the tunnels, their laughter mingling with the relentless creaking of the floorboards. She awoke each morning with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she had been running from something she couldn't remember. The constant stress began to take its toll. Mira's reflection in the mirror looked haggard, her eyes sunken and wild. The house seemed to grow darker, more sinister with each passing day. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. She could hear whispers at all hours, soft and coaxing, always just beyond her comprehension. Determined to confront her fears, Mira sought out Eli and Sarah, hoping they might offer more than their cryptic warnings. She cornered Eli as he worked on the house, his tools clinking softly in the background. "I know there's more to this place than you're letting on," she said, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "The history of the Ashfords, the rituals. Why didn't you tell me?" Eli's face paled, and he shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you've heard," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "People talk about old houses. Things get twisted. I'm just here to fix things, not to scare you." Mira's frustration turned to desperation as she approached Sarah, the neighbor who'd been strangely vague about the house's history. Sarah's face softened slightly as she saw Mira's distress. "The house, it chooses its own," Sarah said quietly. "The Ashford's past is tangled up in it. Sometimes it's not just about what happened. It's about what's still here, waiting." That night, Mira's fears manifested into reality. She saw spectral figures flitting through the shadows of the house, children playing hide and seek in the tunnels beneath her feet. Their laughter echoed eerily, mingling with the whispers of her name, pulling her deeper into the house's secrets. Each whisper seemed to beckon her towards the hidden paths, where something unspeakable waited. Mira was losing her grip on reality. The house was alive, and its past was far from buried. Chapter 5. The House's Hunger. The house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its oppressive weight suffocating Mira as she moved through the rooms. The supernatural occurrences had escalated. Furniture shifted on its own, scraping the floor with a maddening screech. The walls wept with dampness, their grimy tears spreading like veins. The floorboards rattled incessantly, vibrating with an unrelenting hunger that Mira could feel deep in her bones. Nights were unbearable. Mira lay in bed, clutching her pillow, trying to drown out the cacophony of creaks and groans that filled the house. Sleep was elusive, her dreams plagued by dark figures and anguished cries. Every time she closed her eyes, she was pulled into a vortex of shadows and whispers, each one more desperate than the last. The town outside seemed to fade into insignificance. Calls from friends went unanswered, and neighbors' faces turned away from her when she ventured into town. The isolation was complete. The only connection she had left was with the house, a dark and twisted bond that both terrified and fascinated her. She was caught in a nightmare she couldn't wake from, feeling an inexplicable pull to the house even as her sanity slipped away. Desperation drove her back to the tunnels. Each step she took echoed with a sense of dread, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. It was there, among the cobwebs and decay, that she found a dusty, leather-bound journal wedged behind a loose brick. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the musty smell of old paper filling her nostrils. The journal belonged to Thomas Ashford, the last of the house's original owners. The entries were frantic, scribbled in a scrawling hand that revealed the house's dark secret. "Feed the house," Thomas wrote. "Keep it satiated to prevent the rise of what lies beneath." The words were chilling. The house, it seemed, was not just a structure, but a living entity with an insatiable hunger. Mira's heart pounded as she read further. The journal detailed rituals and sacrifices meant to appease the house, to keep its dark hunger at bay. It preyed on grief and guilt, consuming the emotions of those who came near. The realization hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. The house was feeding on her fear, her sorrow, her pain. Her own guilt, a specter from her past, began to claw its way to the surface. She saw her husband's face in every shadow. The grief she thought she had buried deep inside began to rise, threatening to consume her entirely. Mira felt the house's hunger gnawing at her, feeding off her emotions, growing stronger with each passing day. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, a prisoner of her own fears. As the house's demands became more insistent, Mira faced a horrifying truth. To escape, she would have to confront her deepest fears and make a sacrifice of her own. Chapter 6. The First Sacrifice. Mira's nights had become a torturous blur of terror and sleeplessness. The house seemed to be alive, its hunger palpable and suffocating. Each creak of the floorboards was a reminder of its insatiable demand. She was on the edge of madness, her grip on reality slipping with every passing day. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Mira's worst fears materialized. She woke to the sound of guttural chants echoing through the house. The whispers she had heard so often seemed to crescendo into a cacophony of voices. Her heart raced as she followed the noise, driven by a mixture of dread and determination. The house led her to the basement, where she descended into the darkness of the tunnels. The scene she stumbled upon was nightmarish. Eli stood at the center of a makeshift altar, surrounded by flickering candles and strange symbols scrawled on the floor. His hands moved deftly as he chanted in a language Mira couldn't understand. The air was thick with a putrid, metallic scent, and the floorboards above them groaned as though they were under siege. "Mira, you shouldn't be here." Eli's voice was frantic, his eyes wide and feverish. "The house, it's not just haunted. It's alive. It demands blood. I thought I could control it, but it's beyond me now." Mira's mind raced, struggling to process the horrifying scene. control it? You're making it worse," she shouted, her voice breaking. "What are you doing?" Eli's gaze turned sinister, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "The house has chosen you. Your past guilt makes you the perfect offering. It's been waiting for you all along." The reality of his words hit Mira like a punch to the gut. The house had been feeding on her grief, drawing her deeper into its nightmarish grasp. She was trapped in a macabre choice: allow herself to be consumed or sacrifice someone else to the ravenous entity below. Before she could react, the floorboards above them began to splinter and crack, a monstrous force clawing its way up from beneath. The air grew colder, and a low, rumbling growl reverberated through the tunnels. Mira's skin prickled with icy terror as the creature began to emerge, its form shifting and undulating with malevolent intent. Eli's panic intensified. "We have to do this now," he yelled, grabbing Mira in a desperate attempt to drag her toward the altar. His strength was overwhelming, but Mira fought back with every ounce of her being. The struggle was violent, her screams mingling with the guttural growls from below. Just as Eli was about to overpower her, the floorboards splintered violently, and a monstrous, shadowy appendage shot out, wrapping around him. Eli's eyes widened in terror as he was dragged, screaming into the abyss, his cries echoing off the walls. Mira watched in horror, her mind numb with shock as the darkness swallowed him whole. The house's hunger roared louder than ever, the entity now fully emerging from the depths. Mira was left alone, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The house had claimed its first sacrifice, and the horrifying truth settled in: she was now its next victim. Chapter 7: Confronting the Darkness. Mira's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Hollow House. The walls seemed to pulse with a grotesque life of their own, shadows writhing and twisting into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the oppressive weight of despair. Every step she took echoed with the groaning of the floorboards above, as if the house itself was alive and mocking her. Determined to end the house's malevolent grip on her, Mira pressed deeper into the darkness. The whispers from the walls became louder, taunting her with fragments of her own fears and regrets. The oppressive silence was shattered by disembodied voices, their words a chilling cacophony of her past mistakes and unspoken sorrows. It was as if the house had become a living testament to her inner turmoil. In the heart of the tunnels, she found it a forgotten ritual room, its walls covered in ancient symbols and occult markings. The room was a grotesque shrine to whatever force had taken root in the house. The air crackled with dark energy, and Mira felt a cold, malevolent presence lurking just beyond her sight. As she stepped into the room, the shadows coalesced into a tangible form, a monstrous entity with eyes that seemed to burn with a primal hunger. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating darkness that radiated from the very core of the house. Mira's heart pounded in her chest, her resolve wavering as the entity's gaze bore into her. It was then that the truth hit her with brutal clarity. The house had been feeding on her unresolved trauma, her guilt over the death of her spouse, and the sense of failure that had plagued her. The entity was a manifestation of her own inner darkness, an ancient force that thrived on her pain and suffering. To break free, she had to confront and release her own guilt. The house had been exploiting her unresolved emotions, drawing strength from her turmoil. Mira realized that the only way to defeat the house was to let go of the burdens she had been carrying. Tears streamed down her face as she faced the entity. The weight of her past, the sorrow and regret seemed to coalesce into a tangible force within her. With a cry of anguish, she poured all her grief and remorse into a final, desperate act of release. It was a sacrifice of part of herself, a piece of her very soul, given to break the house's hold. The entity roared in fury as the room shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering. Mira fell to her knees, her energy spent as the darkness around her began to recede. The oppressive presence lifted, and the house's malevolent grip loosened. She had faced her deepest fears, and, in doing so, shattered the house's power. As she emerged from the tunnels, the first light of dawn broke through the oppressive gloom. Hollow House stood silent and still, its hunger seemingly sated. Mira had escaped, but the cost was high. She had sacrificed a part of herself, and the scars of her confrontation would remain, a reminder of the darkness she had faced and overcome. Chapter 8: The Final Path. The oppressive darkness of the ritual room began to fade as Mira, exhausted but resolute, moved through the collapsing tunnels. The walls groaned and cracked, debris falling in a cascade of dust and shattered stone. She fought through the debris, her goal clear: destroy the source of the house's power and end its malevolent reign once and for all. With each swing of the hammer she'd found among the scattered ruins, Mira pounded away at the walls and symbols, reducing the ritual room to a smoldering wreck. The room, once a place of unspeakable horror, was now a broken monument to her struggle. As the structure collapsed, Mira felt the house's grip on her life loosening, its oppressive weight lifting. Emerging from the wreckage, Mira found the house eerily silent. The floorboards no longer groaned with the insidious creep of the entity. The malevolent presence that had plagued her seemed to have vanished, leaving behind a chilling stillness. Yet, the silence was unsettling, an emptiness that felt almost as invasive as the previous cacophony of supernatural disturbances. Mira stood in the hallway, her breaths shallow and uneven, her hands trembling. She glanced around at the house, its grandeur now marred by the destruction and decay that had set in. The house was no longer the living nightmare it once was, but something within Mira knew that she was not entirely free. Her past, her guilt, and the house's legacy had intertwined so deeply that separating them now felt impossible. As she prepared to leave, Mira paused at the entrance, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had endured. Her eyes caught the faintest hint of movement in the hallway. The floorboards creaked softly, as if whispering a final ghostly farewell. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible sound, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. With a final, uneasy glance over her shoulder, Mira stepped out of Hollow House. The first rays of dawn bathed the landscape in a golden light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house's darkness might still linger, a haunting presence that would never fully release its grip on her. The novel ends on a note of haunting ambiguity. Mira's victory over the house was hard-won, but the price was high. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged scarred but alive. Floorboards still creaked faintly, a reminder that while the house may be defeated, the echoes of the past and the shadows of unresolved guilt would always remain. As she left Hollow House behind, Mira reflected on the inescapable nature of guilt and the past. Though she had survived, the house's hold over her was a constant reminder that some secrets, once buried, never truly stay buried. They have a way of creeping back, haunting the peripheries of the mind, just as the final creaks beneath the floorboards suggested that the darkness might never be entirely vanquished.